living in a community governed by an HOA can be a double-edged sword. On one hand, the neighborhood looks clean, organized, and safe. On the other hand, you sometimes have to deal with people like Karen. Karen was infamous in our neighborhood. Everyone knew her, and not necessarily for good reasons. She was the self-appointed enforcer of every minor rule in our HOA handbook, the type of person who would walk around with a clipboard and pen, documenting the tiniest infractions like overgrown grass, garbage cans being left out a few minutes too long, or even kids chalk drawing on sidewalks. Karen thrived on enforcing these rules, not because she genuinely cared about the well-being of the community, but because it gave her a sense of power she otherwise lacked. It was a warm Saturday afternoon when the incident happened. I had just gotten back from a grocery run. The visitor parking spaces closer to my unit were all taken, and street parking was limited. However, there was a long curbside stretch within the community property that had no signs prohibiting parking. I had parked there many times before without issue. The curb was wide enough not to obstruct traffic, and my car was neatly within the painted white guidelines that bordered the community roads. I double-checked to make sure I wasn't in front of any fire hydrants or blocking any driveways. Confident that I had parked legally and respectfully, I grabbed my groceries and made my way inside. I hadn't even been inside 5 minutes when I heard a loud, sharp knock at my door. It wasn't a polite knock either, it was the kind of knock you might hear from a police officer trying to get someone's attention immediately. I opened the door, arms still half full of grocery bags, and there stood Karen, hands on her hips, face twisted in a mixture of disdain and self-righteous anger. Without even saying hello, she launched into her tirade. "You're parked illegally," she snapped. "That curb is not for residents. It's reserved for emergency access only." I blinked, trying to process what she was saying. "I'm sorry?" I said, shifting the weight of my grocery bags. "There were no signs. I've parked there before. There's no hydrant or emergency markings." Karen rolled her eyes dramatically. "You don't need a sign. It's common sense. Emergency vehicles need space to get through, and you're blocking it. You need to move your car immediately, or I'll have it towed." Her voice grew louder and louder as a few neighbors peeked through their blinds or subtly watched from their porches. I felt my face flush with a mix of embarrassment and frustration. I glanced over toward where my car was parked. It was neatly aligned along the curb, completely out of the way. There was easily enough room for a fire truck, 2 ambulances, and a marching band to get through if they wanted to. Still, Karen stood there as if she were the sheriff of the neighborhood, demanding compliance with rules she seemed to make up on the spot. I tried to reason with her. "Karen, with all due respect, this curb has no markings. There's no yellow paint, no parking signs, and the HOA handbook doesn't say anything about this section being off limits." I checked. She scoffed loudly, like I was an imbecile. "Just because it's not written down doesn't mean you can park wherever you like. You should know better living here. This is exactly why our neighborhood standards are slipping." At that moment, I realized that there was no winning a logical argument with Karen. To her, it wasn't about the actual rules, it was about her perceived authority. It was about controlling the people around her, under the guise of protecting the community. She wasn't really concerned about emergency vehicles, she was concerned about the fact that someone was doing something without her explicit approval. She pointed aggressively down the street. "Move it now, or I'll call the HOA board and have them fine you," she barked, as if she expected me to drop everything and scurry out in fear. I could feel my blood boiling under my skin. Not because she was pointing out a real problem, I would have been happy to move if I truly was in violation, but because she was so gleefully hostile about it, so unnecessarily aggressive over something so minor and, frankly, non-existent. I took a deep breath and decided not to escalate. I simply told her, "I'll review the rules again, but I'm confident my parking is allowed." That answer was not satisfactory to Karen. She stomped away muttering about irresponsible neighbors, pulling out her phone as if preparing to call in reinforcements. As I closed my door, I peeked through my blinds and saw her snapping pictures of my car from multiple angles, probably planning to email them to the HOA board with a long, angry complaint. The absurdity of it all would have been almost funny if it hadn't been so annoying. Here I was, just trying to unload my groceries on a Saturday afternoon, while Karen was treating the situation like I had committed a felony. What made it even more ridiculous was that in trying to accuse me of wrongdoing, she herself was violating HOA policy by harassing another resident without cause. Later, I would find out just how wrong she was about the parking situation and how her actions would backfire spectacularly, but at that moment, all I felt was the sheer ridiculousness of being targeted over something so trivial. Karen didn't care about the facts, she cared about being in control. And in her mind, any perceived slight against her neighborhood needed to be crushed immediately. This was the reality of living in an HOA with a self-proclaimed enforcer like Karen. It wasn't about community, it was about power plays over the most insignificant things, and unfortunately, I had just become her latest target. The following morning, after the confrontation with Karen, I found myself doing a bit of research. The incident with her had stirred up a strange feeling in me, something between annoyance and concern. Karen's insistence that I had violated some unseen rule made me wonder, was I truly in the wrong? I had parked in the same spot many times before without issue, so I couldn't quite understand what had changed. Was there something I didn't know about the parking regulations? Had I somehow missed a crucial detail in the HOA handbook? I couldn't shake the feeling that maybe I had overlooked something important. I grabbed the HOA handbook from my bookshelf and began skimming through the section on parking regulations. As I flipped through the pages, I started to get a sinking feeling in my stomach. The more I read, the more it seemed like there were very specific rules about where residents and visitors could park. The HOA's guidelines were clear about areas that were designated for emergency vehicles, fire lanes, and private access roads. It wasn't just about the presence or absence of signs. There were actual regulations that had been put in place to ensure the safety of everyone in the community, including emergency access routes. I flipped to the relevant section on parking and found that Karen had, in fact, been partially right. Although there were no visible signs on the curb where I had parked, there was an established emergency vehicle access rule that applied to certain areas of the neighborhood. These zones were not just for aesthetic reasons or general parking convenience, they were critical for ensuring that fire trucks, ambulances, and other emergency vehicles could navigate the streets without obstruction. The guidelines didn't specify that every curb had to have a sign, but they made it clear that any area within a certain proximity to driveways, intersections, and hydrants was off limits for parking. The section where I had parked fell into that category. My stomach dropped. I had genuinely thought I was in the clear, but it turned out I had unknowingly broken a rule. The fine for parking in such areas could be hefty, up to $500. The reality of the situation hit me hard. It wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a significant violation that I could be penalized for. I had no idea that my casual parking had been such a serious offense. I couldn't help but feel a little embarrassed. My assumption that I was simply being harassed by a Karen now felt naive. The truth was, I had broken a rule that I didn't even know existed, and now I was facing the consequences. But as I processed this information, something else also became clear. Karen had, in her rush to accuse me, misunderstood the situation as well. She had been so quick to label me a rule breaker and demand that I move my car without taking a moment to consider whether the rule she was enforcing even applied to me. In her mind, she had been acting as the protector of the community, ensuring that everyone followed the rules. But she had been equally ignorant of the finer details of the regulations she claimed to enforce. I decided that the best course of action was to clear things up directly with Karen. I waited until the afternoon when I knew she would likely be out tending to her garden or walking her dog. When I saw her outside, I walked over, holding a printout of the relevant section from the HOA handbook. I tried to keep my tone neutral, not wanting to escalate the situation further. "Hey, Karen," I began, trying to sound casual. I did some reading up on the parking regulations, and I realized that I actually made a mistake. I parked in an area that's designated for emergency access. I didn't know, but I understand now why it's an issue. I just wanted to clear that up with you. Karen's initial reaction was one of disbelief. She crossed her arms and raised an eyebrow, looking like she had expected me to be more defensive or confrontational. Her face softened slightly as she took the printout from my hand and scanned it. "Well, I suppose I could have been wrong too," she muttered, clearly taken aback. "But this is why we need people to follow the rules, you know. We can't let things slide just because someone doesn't know." I nodded, trying to remain calm despite the sense of awkwardness that hung in the air. "I understand. But I think it's important for all of us to know the rules, not just assume things. I appreciate that you pointed it out, even if it was a bit harsh at first. Karen didn't respond immediately. She stood there for a moment, looking down at the paper in her hands. Then, as if realizing the irony of the situation, she let out a small, frustrated sigh. I guess I got a little carried away. I mean, I thought I was doing the right thing. But you're right, I didn't know all the details either. The tension between us started to ease, and I could tell that Karen was processing her own role in the situation. She had been quick to judge, but now, seeing the facts laid out before her, she seemed less certain of her position. I think we both learned something here, she said finally, a little more humbly than before. Maybe I should have double-checked the rules myself before jumping to conclusions. I'll make sure to do that next time. I nodded, relieved that the situation wasn't escalating further. I think that's a good idea. We all want to make sure this place stays safe and respectful, and it's important to follow the rules. But it's also important to understand them fully before accusing someone else. Karen seemed to agree, though I could tell she was still a little embarrassed by how quickly she had acted. As we parted ways, I couldn't help but feel a sense of both relief and frustration. It was good to clear things up, but it was still unsettling to think about how easily things could have gotten worse. If I hadn't taken the time to check the rules myself, I could have ended up with a fine I wasn't prepared for. And Karen, for all her posturing, had learned the hard way that sometimes the people who enforce the rules need to understand them just as thoroughly as the people they're accusing. This incident reminded me of a larger truth. In any community, whether it's governed by an HOA or not, it's crucial to ensure that everyone is on the same page when it comes to understanding the rules. It's not enough to simply demand compliance, people need to be educated about the guidelines, and we all need to be willing to admit when we're wrong. The lesson here wasn't just about knowing the rules, it was about fostering a community based on mutual respect and understanding. If everyone could take a moment to approach situations with more empathy, things would run a lot more smoothly. In the end, it's not about being right, it's about making sure that everyone, including ourselves, is treated fairly.